Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week I'm going to service this lovely Cube Cross Race and showing you just how many problems we can uncover along the way during a simple service. We found some issues from when the bike was built that were not great in terms of quality control, and also the pedals needed a service, so a few interesting details in this episode. This bike is going to be used for a sportive at the weekend, and the customer brought this in for a pre-sportive check, so let's get started. You can see here chain has stretched almost to 0.75%. It's recommended on 12 speed, especially on the Di2, to replace that at 0.5. So this chain has actually already worn out on this bike. I know the rider has done quite a few hundred miles on this bike, but these chains do need replacing quite regularly on these drivetrains. So that's one of the things we are going to be replacing on this bike. What I'm going to do, I'm going to take this bike apart, work on the components on the bench, clean up the frame whilst it's stripped down, and then rebuild the bike. So start with taking the wheels out and then this cassette off. So you can see here, it's not too bad, and with that chain being replaced at the perfect timing, this will go for another chain or two, so we'll clean that one up. We'll put that through an ultrasonic cleaner to really bring that up, and then that will be ready to go back on the bike. Unplugging the Di2 socket there on the rear derailleur, and I immediately noticed the rear derailleur hanger and dropout was loose in the frame, so we'll need to make sure that that's secure when we put it back on the bike, when we put the wheel back in and the derailleur. So we'll remove that derailleur, we'll clean that up as well. You can see here jockey wheels are just beginning to gather a little bit of dirt and debris on them, so we need to clean those off, make sure everything there is clean and ready to go back on the bike. And then the front derailleur, oh my word, this was bad really. You can see here a massive gap between the body of the derailleur and the teeth of the front chainring. Way too much gap there. Recommended around about 2 mil really, but you can see it's right at the top of the hanger there. And also on this derailleur, it actually has a little screw that sits inside it that supports it on the derailleur hanger itself. It's just above the spring there, in line with the mount bolt, and you can see that that's wound fully home. It's not been adjusted at all, so we'll also make sure that we do that when we put it back on the bike. Now I'm removing the pedals. This customer has actually been involved in quite a bad accident, and he's recently had another operation on one of his legs, so he's asked us to redo the bearings in the pedals and also slacken those off so it's a little bit easier for him getting his cleats in and out of the shoes. So we've took those off, we're going to deal with those, and that's quite a big job in itself, doing the pedal bearings. Also going to remove the chain set. I need to check that the bottom bracket and the pre-tension here and everything is all okay when it goes back on the bike. I also want to clean these up, and I'm going to sort of do some preventative maintenance by lubricating between the chain rings on this chain set to make sure that they're nicely serviceable in the future. Quite a bit of dirt and debris in that center right where the axle goes through the bottom bracket. Again, this is preventative maintenance. I'm going to remove these pivot pins on these brake calipers. They are notorious for seizing and corroding into the calipers, so I'm going to do a little bit of preventative maintenance that you'll see there on the bench. I'll also clean up these brake pads at the same time, so I'll remove those and make sure that they're ready and good for the weekend for his big ride. I'm going to break down this rear derailleur, so I'm removing the jockey wheels. I'm going to clean those up, generally wash down this derailleur part as well, just to make sure that it's nice, and also lubricate it so that when it goes back on the bike it should perform exceptional. I'm going to break down the chain set, so I'm breaking down the bolts here. You can see they're quite tight, but they were around about right. We'll actually torque these up when we put them back on the bike. Shimano have really drilled down this system with these bolts that thread straight into the chain rings. It's nice and straightforward and much easier to take apart than some other systems. And then the only thing I need to deep clean today is the cassette, so that goes in the ultrasonic cleaner. I'm putting a little cap here in the electronic plug-in on these derailleurs to make sure we don't get any water inside those. These are a waterproof item, they have a rating, but we're just going to gently wash these down with warm soapy water, dry them off with a microfiber towel, blow them out with an airline before we put them back together. You can see there's quite a bit of dirt already building up on the back of that derailleur. Very hard part to clean when it's on the bike, so that's why we like to take them off and clean them as we are here. Same with this chain ring, you can see it's got those little recesses. The detailing brush here that we're using is nice for getting inside those recesses and really cleaning them up. And the same with the cassette. I do like these 105 cassettes. It doesn't matter what generation we're on. The 105 is almost like a chrome plated cassette. All the rings are like that, where on Ultegra and Dura-Race they start to use fancy metals and they never clean up quite as nice as 105 cassettes do. I do like doing a 105 cassette. Next up, I'm just cleaning down the jockey wheels, so we're removing that debris that's on them, so that all comes off. Everything there is nice now, and we can then lubricate those. So I'm using a little bit of our premium grease there. I dispense those in one of our syringes. You can see there we have a set of 5 syringes. So I'm just lubricating the pivot that goes inside this jockey wheel as well. That's ready to go back on the bike, and we've done that the same with the other one. Then I'm using a little bit of the thread locker here in the threads that hold the pivots into the jockey wheels themselves, so they go in. These jockey wheels are handed. There's a guide pulley jockey wheel and a tension pulley jockey wheel, so we need to make sure we get those the right way up. And then the jockey wheels are also directional, so they need to be turning the correct way as well. And then we can tighten everything down there, and that's ready to go back on the bike. But we are just going to lubricate it. These do have moving parts, so we treat them the same as a mechanical derailleur. So in this instance, I'm lubricating the springs in the center, and then I'm also putting a little bit of our general purpose oil on the pivots of the derailleur as well. But this part here, the actuator arm, is really important to lubricate. That can seize long term, so we want to make sure that we avoid that. Same with the front derailleur. Treat it like a mechanical part, even though it has that quite strong motor inside it. So lubricate the springs, lubricate the pivot points, and then also this arm actuator inside there as well. And in this case, it's not all about oiling for performance, but just to give that coating against corrosion. Now, this was another little thing I noticed here. This is the through axle for the rear. You can see how this is sliding down the axle itself. That groove there is actually for an O-ring, and the O-ring was completely missing, so we're going to replace that. So slide that back on, find a little O-ring to fit. We've got this one here, so we'll just clip that on over the top of the threads and roll that down and clip that into that groove before we lubricate. These are very prone to seizing in wheels, so you always want to make sure that you lubricate the through axles. So I'm using some general purpose grease and some anti-seize grease on the threads. Same here. This is what I was talking about with preventative maintenance on the chain set. So I've put some anti-seize grease on the threads of the bolts that hold this together, and then some general purpose grease on the arms of the actual crank itself. This will just stop those sticking to it, bonding to it, causing that dissimilar metal corrosion that you get with the stainless steel against the aluminium. By lubricating that nicely, will just help all that and make it a little bit easier to take apart in the future and stop some of that corrosion that you get between those parts. So once that's together, I'm going to torque that up. You'll see I do this in diagonal motion over from corner to corner. That says I get a nice even pull on those when I put them together. Next up, I'm going to turn my attention to the pedal. We're going to replace the bearings in these pedals, give these a nice service. You can see here I'm using a special Shimano tool. This is specific for their pedals, fits their bolts and pre-tensioners and everything inside the pedals themselves. So we just break that off. They're always quite tight. You can see there a little bit of force needed to undo those, but we remove the lock ring and also the cone that holds those bearings together. So out comes the cone and the lock ring, and then that will slide off and we can start to get to the bearings and clean everything up. So there's 2 rows of bearings in these, and they're tiny little bearings. So out comes the first row there with a magnet, and then we'll just clean up that cup as well. So give that a little clean out with a microfiber towel. And then also we have a little spacer here, this little spacer. It's important to put this back in the right way round. And then there's a row of bearings below that, so I'll just use the magnet there to remove the bearings out of that, and again clean that up inside there. Everything there is good. Just clean this little spacer up as well, make sure that that's clean before it goes back in. We're going to be putting fresh grease in here, and you can see how dirty the grease is in this. This customer was using these pedals because he found them slightly easier with his current recovering leg, and I'm pleased to say that the ride that he's doing the Sportive on Sunday is actually his first ride since having that quite major operation. And also, you have actually seen this customer's bikes before on the channel. He's quite happy to lend us bikes for filming, and he's one of our staunch supporters, so I do wish him the very best for his ride at the weekend and his recovery. Now I'm washing the pedal body down. It was pretty scratched up. We removed all the grease and grit and it looked much cleaner by the time we'd finished. In go new bearings here. I've put our premium grease in there, lovely for these kind of races, perfect grease for this. So we just put an extra row around there, no harm in having too much grease inside a pedal because it's very hard to service them and maintain them without actually doing the full job. So a little bit of grease here. Again, we're going to actually put the bearings onto this shaft rather than trying to get them into the pedal itself. This will hold them while I put it back together. This is quite a practiced skill really to be able to do this successfully, but I've done many of them so I can do that, but the first few it takes a bit of practice. So on goes the pedal body now over that axle, in goes the adjusters, and then we're putting back on the tool to get the adjustment of that about right, so I feel for that. Then goes on the lock nut onto the top, and then I'll put that fitting back over to hold that tension that I've already got. So we just hold that, lock off that lock ring, and that's now ready for the cap to go back on and the pedal nicely serviced. So we just remove these two components here, and then I'll put the cap on. So it's just a little plastic cover really to stop the water and anything getting into those bearings. So tap that back in, that's quite hard to get in and out. And then I've just got to slacken off the tension on these cleats so that it does make it a little bit easier for our rider to get these feet in and out of these. So we loosen those right off for him and they're ready to go back on. And now I'm going to clean up those brake pads. It's fairly straightforward. I just brush off the braking surface with a wire brush to reveal a much fresher layer with no contaminants. A little bit of debris build-up. The one on the right has been cleaned. You can see the score lines just beginning to form on the one on the left there. So I'll also clean up all four of the pads to make sure that they're good to go moving forwards. There wasn't too much wear in those, so that's good. Next up, I'm going to wash down the frame. I did like this frame. Initially when it came in, I thought it was white, but actually, depending on what light you got it in, I think it was a very, very pale blue. Simon thought it was a pale grey, and you can see there it looks quite blue in that light, and then in other lights it looks grey, and then in other lights it looks white. So quite an unusual colour on this one, but very unique to the Cube. We are in a shop, we don't want to get everything soaking wet. We don't jet wash off bikes or completely douse them in water. We just do this nice gentle wash with our big softy brush there. Wash it all down. You can see that's a nice fine brush, very soft, ideal for indoor cleaning like we're doing here. And then I'll dry that off with a microfiber towel. Again, I blow some of the little areas out with an airline just to make sure that everything's dry in the nooks and crannies that you can't even get to with this. We do have a shop, so do check out our shop on the link on the description below. A lot of what we use in these servicing videos we do sell, and it's a great way of just supporting the channel, especially with Christmas coming up. We really appreciate all the orders. It's the only way we can continue with the YouTube. So if you've ever bought from us or if you're going to buy from us in the future, we really do appreciate every single order, so thank you very much. I'm cleaning the disc rotors now. I've sanded those down to get all the scoring off them, and then cleaned them down with a brake cleaner and a microfiber towel, and then I'm washing the wheel down. Now I often talk about how washing a wheel is a tactile process for me. It's a way of checking the integrity of the wheel. What I did notice here was actually that the tyre was rotating the wrong way around. So they are directional tyres and this one was wrong, so we're going to sort that out momentarily. As you can see, that gum wall on the tyre came up nice and clean as well. These are really well designed now to stand the test of time and not stain, so that's all good. And now I'll grease the hub to stop that corroding into the future. I'm going to put the cassette back on, so we just feed all the little cogs on there, all the spaces in their correct order before putting the lock ring on. So on goes the lock ring, and then we'll actually torque that up as well, because it's impossible to do that once it's on the bike, so I need to make sure that's correct. Everything's good there. And then I'm going to swap round this rotational tyre. This was actually quite a little fight really. These Pirelli tyres are actually quite a tight fit on any wheel. They're often fiddly to get off and on as well. Take out the inner tube to give me a little bit of room, and then I actually also still had to use a tyre lever to get that second layer over the rim itself where it was so tight on there. It's important these rotate the right way, not so much when you're off-road, but actually if you're on tarmac and there's a little bit of a puddle, it will force the water to the center of the tire rather than pushing it out from the center. So it can actually cause you to aquaplane or just lose a little bit of stability on your tire through having tires rotating the wrong way. So we've turned that round, and then we can inflate that to the same pressure as previously. These actually take a low pressure being gravel tyres, so I only pump these up to 40 psi, and then of course back on with that lock ring and dust cap to complete the wheel. Put a little bit of our premium grease here on the chain set before I put that back in, just to help it slides back in the bearing. So that goes on, pedal arm on, and you can see there how clean that is. But just note the marks on the chain stays there, those little black marks. I'm going to talk about those moving forward through the video, and it's quite unusual what's caused that. In goes the bolts, torque those up, make sure that everything there is where it needs to finally be before putting the front derailleur on. I'm going to grease the threads inside here for the pedals. I know this rider does swap things around on his bikes, so I want to make my job easier when I come to doing that. So if these pedals have got to come off again, I need to make sure they will. So I've lubricated the threads there, and then we just thread those pedals on, and then we can start putting the derailleurs back on. So front derailleur, note the gap there I've got on the mount itself. It's moved much closer to the teeth, and then that was the bolt that I was talking about at the start that was never adjusted correctly. So torque everything up there, and that's now absolutely perfect, and clip that one in. I'm going to tighten up this derailleur hanger. I mentioned that at the beginning how loose that was, and then I'm also just going to put a little bit of grease on the pivot for the derailleur. This is one of the direct mount derailleurs. The newer generations are all starting to do this, where they directly mount to the hanger. Just a little bit less movement, everything's a little bit stronger this way. So tighten that up, clip in that cable. We've actually got an issue with this Di2 that I'll show you when we do the updates on it as well, which was quite unique, and actually it's the first time I've seen that issue that I'm going to show you. So on goes that cable cover. This is the pivot that goes through the brake pads, and they all seize. So I'm going to apply a small amount of grease on the thread and the shaft. It looks a lot more here than it is in actuality, because I wipe it in and then wipe the excess off. In goes those brake pads, and then this pivot goes in with that nicely lubricated thread, which will hopefully stop that from corroding into the caliper that we often see. It's important with these not to over tighten them. They just need to be pinched up, as you have the retaining clip on the other side to secure it. Again, I see these with the heads totally wrung off where they've been over tightened and chewed up. So on goes that clip there. And go to those through axles, again, as you saw on the bench, all lubricated. Nice to be able to take them back out of the bike easier next time. And then on goes a brand new chain. I've already sized this chain to the bike to make sure that it's the right length, so we've removed a couple of links out of the packet before we put it on the bike, and then we clip that together with a brand new quick link. So it's a brand new chain, clip that together, and that's now ready to ride. So next up, we're going to update the Di2, and immediately I had these two red markers through the shifters, and it was saying that these were non-compatible with the rest of the system. I'd never seen this before. These are 7170s, the rest of the components are 7150s. So what I initially did was to disconnect the shifters to see whether there were updates on the rest of the system, and you can see that there were actually some front derailleur and battery updates to be done. So I did those. I then thought that maybe if I plugged everything in and together, that would do away with this incompatibility error that I had on the software. So you can see I've just disconnected and I'm reconnecting the shifters, plug everything back in. Again, we had this incompatibility. We checked the specs on the bike. This was how it was sold and how it was spec'd to have this different shifters to the system. But what I then did was update each shifter wired in individually. So I'm just doing the left hand shifter here. So that had an update on it. So I thought, well, that's good. That should show that that will then make it compatible. And then plugged in the right shifter. We had an update on the right hand shifter, stands to reason as we had that on the left one. So now I've got all the components updated and the shifters updated. So I thought I would be able to plug it in and everything would be recognized. But once again, when I plugged everything in, we had this incompatibility issue within the software. I think this is actually just a software glitch because all the components are now up to date, and you can see here everything is working perfectly on the bike. So I think that probably what will happen is Shimano will put an update in place that will actually solve that issue, but it's not an issue in terms of the bike being able to be used. So I was quite happy for this to go out with that incompatibility issue showing. Checked all the gear in there, checked all the brakes. Everything here is working nicely. The brakes, you can see, are spinning freely inside the calipers. We've got no binding or grabbing of any of the disc rotors or brakes themselves. And now I'm on to torquing up the bike. I did the left hand shifter here and you can see a lot of movement that was very, very loose. And then I realized that the right hand shifter was actually, you could move it on the handlebars. It was completely loose. It had come loose. So I don't think these would have ever been torqued quite right. So torqued this up. And then when I stood back from the bike, I suddenly realized that this right hand shifter, not only had it come loose, but it worked its way around the handlebar. So when I put a level on the left hand shifter there, you can see it's really dropped down significantly. It doesn't take a lot of movement because it's going around an arc to drop that hood right the way down. So I needed to undo that, move it back up and then realign it with a ruler. So you can see there, it comes up quite a way. We actually didn't need to redo the bar tape. Everything there sat okay. So that was okay, but it did need doing. And this is why it's so important to get bikes, even when they're new, serviced. When you think the front derailleur was too high on its fitting and these shifters were loose and we had updates needed on the Di2 and a lot of little nuances to this bike that really made this service worthwhile, and why really you almost need to get brand new bikes serviced before you even ride them. Torqued up the pedals, going right the way through the bike with the torque wrench. You can see there a little bit of movement on the seat post, and also the saddle had a little bit of movement in it. Then the rear derailleur, of course, no pinch bolts to torque up here as it's Di2, just the mount. And then you can see there, quarter of a turn on the mount for the brake caliper. So again, needed torquing up correctly. Through axles, obviously we've had the wheels off, so they're going to need torquing up as we do it. And then also the mounts here for the rear brake, quite a bit of movement in those. They were also slightly loose. So you can really see why we torque everything up and quality check the bike, even from new. And then one of the other things we just noticed here was the tags of the tyres. I thought this was movement because it was quite a wide tyre in this space, but it was actually these injection moulding tags that were on the tyre, you can see, were skimming the frame and were actually rubbing the paint. Another 1,000, 2,000 miles on these tyres and we'd have had bald patches, we'd have had actual paint that had worn right through to the frame itself. So we're going to nip all those off. This is quite a patience tester, but I have to go right the way around the tyre and nip all those injection mouldings off. And actually I also did the front tyre as well to even everything up. But such a simple thing that if you never notice, you can do so much damage to a frame simply because this care hasn't been taken by manufacturers to remove these. So you can see now we've got that clearance that we need, that these are no longer skimming that frame and causing that wear. So you can see here we've made a massive difference to this bike. We've cleaned everything up, everything's lubricated, everything's set where it needs to be. We've got all the firmware updates nicely done, a brand new chain, and everything's ready to go. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please do like and subscribe. You can do both of those on the TV by clicking down and across. And thanks very much for watching. So we'll see you again next week. Bye for now.